Hey there, lovers of digging through the dirty laundry of the dream factory. Today we're going to dissect the ones who had it all: fame, talent, paychecks with an obscene number of zeros, and still traded it for a glassy stare and an autopsy report. Welcome to our rundown of wrecked lives. Top 10 black actors who lost their careers and their lives to addiction. Meet Nelson Ellis. If you watched True Blood, you remember Lafayette Reynolds, the guy who could put any vampire in their place with a single flick of fake lashes. On screen, he was a swaggering, immortal blast of charisma. In real life, he was a skittish hostage to the bottle. So terrified of Nelson was a Juilliard graduate, the elite of the elite, and even that diploma couldn't hand him the formula for saving himself from his own demons. While fans worshipped his talent, he spent years fighting a brutal guerrilla war against alcohol and drugs. He bounced from rehab to rehab like it was a day job, and every time he came back to the same starting line, eaten alive by his own shame. And this is where the real tabloid horror kicks in. In July 2017, the 39-year-old actor decided he was tougher than medicine and tried to quit, hard, alone. Overnight, cold turkey. Sounds like a menu item. In reality, it was his death sentence. What happened at Woodhull Hospital in New York reads less like a human death and more like a system crash. The moment alcohol stopped flowing through his blood, Nelson's body started shutting down. 4 days of hell. Kidneys failing, a liver swollen to absurd size, infection poisoning his bloodstream, blood pressure dropping so low the monitors might as well have been running on empty. In the end, his heart couldn't keep up with the madness and simply tapped out, gone, like it logged off. The cruel irony is that Nelson didn't die chasing a high. He died trying to get clean. His family, exhausted by the Hollywood code of silence, dumped the whole mess into the press, hoping his ruined organs might serve as a warning to someone else. Even True Blood creator Alan Ball, who called him a genius, seemed to have no idea that behind the bright, razor-sharp Lafayette was a man rotting alive from shame and liquor. Nelson, at least, tried to fight in silence, hiding behind hospital doors. But our next hero decided hiding was boring. He turned his life into an endless series of court dates and handcuffs, making producers cross his name off the living long before a pathologist ever did. Next up, the detective who confused the role with reality. Well, if Nelson Ellis was a master of quiet tragedy behind the curtains of hospital wards, then our next hero, Howard E. Rollins Jr., decided hiding from the public was for amateurs. Why conceal an addiction when you can turn it into must-see television, police chases, courtroom drama, the whole damn circus? There's a particular kind of Hollywood irony here, playing the most righteous, principle-driven cop on screen, while in real life the door of a jail cell is slamming shut behind you. Howard crashed into Hollywood's top tier so hard, the old guard must have ground their teeth down to powder. An Oscar nomination and a Golden Globe nomination for Ragtime, critics falling over themselves, the shiny label of a new intellectual icon. It looked like he was headed for immortality on the Walk of Fame. But Hollywood isn't just camera flashes, it's also high-speed highways, and Rollins started losing control in the most literal way. When he landed the role of Detective Virgil Tibbs on In the Heat of the Night, the industry figured he'd lock in his success. Howard figured it was the perfect excuse to pad his resume at local precincts. The sarcasm is savage. While NBC audiences admired how smoothly Tibbs hunted criminals, the real Howard Rollins became a raking nightmare for the network's lawyers. His career turned into an endless loop: shoot, arrest, court, rehab, repeat. In 1988, he officially admitted that cocaine in Louisiana wasn't a prop, it was his personal property. You think that stopped him? Not even close. He just hit the gas harder, often while he was completely blasted. In 1992 and 1993, he was nailed 3 separate times for DUI. Eventually, the producers, sick of prying their detective out of a cell, showed him the door at the end of season 6. Picture it. You're a primetime star, and in 1994, you spend a month in jail for reckless driving and drunk driving. That was the end. Every attempt to bring him back as a guest star looked less like a comeback and more like a pity offering from colleagues who couldn't stand watching a gifted man collapse into rubble. Howard's ending was as merciless as his fall. In 1996, at just 46, he died of lymphoma, with AIDS already diagnosed in the background. The official obituaries talked about illness, but everyone understood the subtext. His body wasn't just sick, it was scorched, burned out by years of abusing anything that could numb him, ignite him, or lift him off the ground. He became a living monument to one brutal truth. Even an Oscar nomination in your pocket won't save you from the pavement if you decide the law's just another line in your script. But if Rollins at least got to hold the trophy-shaped promise of fame and cash those NBC checks, our next heroine carved a path for generations of black actresses, only to finish in absolute silence with a couple of pathetic scraps of paper in her wallet. Now we move to a woman who was too beautiful for her era and too fragile for a system that crowned her first and then left her to die in poverty. Meet our third heroine, Dorothy Dandridge, a woman too dazzling for her time and too proud for a system that crowned her a queen and then tossed her onto the trash heap with $2 to her name. If you think modern Hollywood is cruel, you haven't seen how the Dream Factory chewed up the first black goddesses of the screen. Dorothy was first at everything, the first African-American woman on the cover of Life, the first to make white critics hold their breath, and the first black woman nominated for Best Actress at the Academy Awards in 1954 for Carmen Jones. But here's the sickest irony in this Hollywood fairy tale. While her competitor Grace Kelly took home the statue and rode off to marry a prince, Dorothy Dandridge rode off into nowhere. Hollywood simply didn't know what to do with a black woman who looked like a goddess but refused to play maids, slaves, or decorative exotic furniture. She wanted to be the next Marilyn Monroe, but she was born in the right place in the completely wrong time. Dorothy's personal life could have been its own long-running series. Tabloids would have eaten it alive. Her first husband, tap dancer Harold Nicholas, preferred chasing other skirts, while Dorothy fought to care for their daughter, Carolyn, who was born with severe brain damage. That was her first deep crack. The crushing medical bills and round-the-clock care slowly, steadily drained her of money, of energy, of hope. Then came the White Savior chapter, director Otto Preminger. Their affair was so scandalous the black community practically spat on Dorothy for being involved with a white man. But even that storm was just the warm-up compared to what her second husband, Jack Dennison, did to her. He wasn't just a husband, he was a human vacuum cleaner attached to her bank account. He beat Dorothy, and he somehow managed to burn through every cent she had on his disastrous restaurant venture. By 1963, Dorothy, the woman who'd once walked through Cannes like royalty, was broke. She was forced to place her daughter in a state institution because she could no longer pay for care. And that's when the next co-stars entered the scene: antidepressants and alcohol. When reality becomes unbearable, Hollywood always offers a pill. Dorothy tried to smother depression and the shame of bankruptcy with a cocktail of booze and heavy medication. Her ending, in September 1965, in a West Hollywood apartment, is tragedy distilled to its purest form. 42 years old, an empty room, a couple of empty bottles, and exactly $2 left to her name. Officially, an overdose of antidepressants. Unofficially, a broken heart and a body finally collapsing under a system that never gave her a real chance. She paved the road for Halle Berry, but she finished her own journey in total poverty, a martyr for the simple right to be treated like a star. Dorothy left behind a trail of unrealized dreams and tax debts,
But if you think she was haunted only by personal demons, hold that thought. Our next legend was so dangerous to the system that her death became a full-blown thriller where the villains weren't drugs, but federal agents hunting a dying woman right inside a hospital room.
Next up, the one whose voice became her own sentence. If you thought Hollywood was just a place where dreams go to die, Billie Holiday will prove it's also a place where the state can methodically, almost gleefully, grind you into the dirt until you stop breathing. Dorothy Dandridge died broke. Billie died under police supervision, handcuffed to a hospital bed, because to the Dream Factory and federal agents, she wasn't a jazz legend, she was just a junkie they meant to finish off. Meet Billie Holiday, or Eleanor Fagan if you're the IRS or the cops. Lady Day was an icon, a voice that could make stones cry, but her life was a hymn to pain that started with child prostitution in Harlem, $5 a client. When your origin story looks like that, heroin and alcohol don't feel like bad habits, they feel like the only way not to lose your mind. But her biggest problem wasn't needles, it was a song. The moment Billie sang Strange Fruit, that brutal protest against lynching, she signed her own death warrant in Harry Anslinger's eyes. Anslinger, the head of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, was a real piece of work. He called jazz jungle music, the kind of sound that made black people feel equal to white people, and that idea horrified him. Billie Holiday became his personal target. He hunted her for decades, using everything he could get his hands on: undercover agents, planted cases, and even her own abusive men who were happy to sell her out to the feds. In 1947, she was tried in United States versus Billie Holiday, and as she later said, that's exactly what it felt like, an entire country versus one exhausted woman. They sent her to Alderson Prison, where she didn't sing a single note. When she got out, they stripped her of her cabaret card, effectively cutting her throat financially by banning her from performing in the clubs where she could actually earn a living, the one thing she knew how to do. The final act, in 1959, is pure horror. Billie was dying of cirrhosis and heart failure at Metropolitan Hospital. While she lay there in critical condition, federal agents stormed her room, searched it, and charged her with narcotics possession right on her deathbed. They handcuffed her to the bed, put her under round-the-clock guard, kept friends away, and when she started to show signs of improving, they even stopped her methadone, forcing withdrawal on a body already collapsing, basically killing her with the shakes. Want to know what was left of the great Billie Holiday? When she died on July 17, 1959, at 44 years old, her bank account held exactly 70 cents. And here's the greasy little detail for the gossip lovers: $750 in cash, tabloid money, was taped to her leg, hidden there because she didn't trust a single soul in that world anymore. She left this life branded a criminal in the eyes of the law, a symbol of how a system can weaponize someone's addiction just to shut them up. Billie Holiday was tragedy, with the clink of handcuffs and the whisper of federal agents in the background. But while some stars turn their agony into a case study, others managed to turn their drinking and legal mess into a full-blown comedy routine. Our next hero didn't die broke. He preferred driving drunk in a Cadillac Escalade and turning ankle monitors into a fashion statement. Next up, the comedian who proved that if you're funny enough, even 2 back-to-back DUIs are just material for your next stand-up set. Who said alcoholism isn't funny? Tracy Morgan apparently decided it was perfect punchline material. Meet our number 5, the man whose real-life mugshot looks more convincing than anything he ever did on Saturday Night Live or 30 Rock. On screen, his Tracy Jordan is just a lovable idiot with the emotional range of a spoiled kid. In real life, Morgan in the mid-2000s became a walking anti-ad for driving under the influence. Hollywood producers love charisma, but when your charisma smells like a packed brewery at rush hour, even NBC's most patient bosses start to crack.
Tracy's big moment in the police blotter hit in November 2006. Picture it, 4:30 a.m., Manhattan, a shiny Cadillac Escalade swerving down the road like it's being driven not by a comedy star, but by his imaginary best friend. When the cops boxed him in, Tracy didn't go with the classic "I'm just tired" routine. He admitted he'd stopped by a club for a couple of drinks. The only problem was he was already on probation for the exact same kind of arrest in Hollywood a year earlier. Back in 2005, he'd been flying like a bullet, and his blood alcohol level was 0.13%. For most people, that's a trip to the ER. For Tracy, it was just, "I barely loosened up." To avoid landing in jail for violating probation, the comedian had to wear the hottest accessory of the season, a Scram ankle monitor. This cute little bracelet analyzed his sweat every 30 minutes for ethanol vapor. On top of that, he got sent to schools to lecture kids about the dangers of drunk driving. In an interview with the Associated Press, he talked with a straight face about valuing sobriety one day at a time, then nearly fell off his chair laughing as he admitted what he really wanted most in the world was 25 or 30 drinks. They say there's truth in every joke, and with Tracy, the truth was simple. At that point, his career was hanging by a thread. On the 30 Rock set, people treated him like an unmanageable toddler. Between his chronic lateness and his habit of disappearing on side quests, the crew started setting every clock an hour ahead just so Tracy would show up by the time cameras rolled. Add in his struggle to read cue cards, the constant risk of another binge derailing production, and you get the portrait of an actor with one foot on top of the world and the other already on the prison bus. Morgan survived and even stayed in the game after that horrific 2014 crash, but his golden years will always live in the industry's memory as an endless series about an ankle bracelet and the stench of stale booze in the makeup trailer. But while Tracy was learning to walk around with his fashionable little ankle accessory, the next saint on our list used every ounce of Hollywood cunning to pass off a brutal ecstasy high as expired vitamins. Brace yourself, we're about to peek under Jada Pinkett Smith's red table, where she's been polishing our brains for years with all that enlightened talk. Oh, would you look at this holy woman? Today, Jada Pinkett Smith is Hollywood's chief enlightened guru, sitting at her red table teaching us how to live, breathe, and forgive cheating. Sorry, entanglements. But before she reinvented herself as the patron saint of mindfulness, Jada was a straight-up chaos queen whose career nearly ended in a puddle of vomit and drugged-out blackouts. You know what she calls herself? A walking miracle. And when you look at her past, you realize the miracle isn't her growth. The miracle is that nobody kicked her out of the industry back in the 90s. Jada started her early career as a liquor tester in high school, favoring vodka and hard liqueur. While other girls were picking prom dresses, our heroine was trying to outdrink every guy in the county. When she moved to California, she decided vodka alone wasn't enough for a future star, so she added a lethal little cocktail to her daily menu: ecstasy, weed, and alcohol. She lived in a constant float, chasing what she called peace in her head and finding nothing but the bottom of a bottle instead. The juiciest scandal, the one Jada spent years trying to sell as an unfortunate accident, went down in 1996 on the set of The Nutty Professor. Picture it, a young, up-and-coming actress collapses in her trailer, practically in front of Eddie Murphy. And when she came to, you know what she told the producers? That she'd mixed up bottles and taken some expired medicine that happened to be stored in a vitamins container. In reality, it was a brutal hit from a bad batch of ecstasy. Hollywood swallowed the lie, even though everyone knew exactly what they were looking at. Jada admitted later that day was the closest she ever came to having her name permanently erased from casting lists. Even Debbie Allen, legendary Iron Spine Debbie Allen, finally snapped when Jada threw up in her house. Think about the level of party required for Debbie Allen to start giving you sobriety lectures.
But Jada kept marching down the self-destruction road, getting to the point where she'd drink 2 bottles of wine alone and already be reaching for a third. This wasn't glamorous socialite sipping at premieres. This was quiet, filthy decay behind closed doors, fed by depression and inheritance, because her mother, for the record, was on heroin for more than 20 years. Now the Smith family has turned all that messy history into profitable content, expertly airbrushing the past into a healing journey. Jada managed to stop at the edge of the cliff, grabbing onto Will and her red table at the last second, an altar and a shield rolled into one. She survived, she kept her status, and she turned her mistakes into a high-budget confessional. But if Jada Pinkett Smith could hide her high behind vitamin bottles, our next guy didn't even bother pretending. He collapsed on a kitchen floor in a pool of his own blackout right in front of his 8-year-old daughter, and 2 weeks later, he became the biggest star on Earth.
Next up, the man whose best makeup for an Oscar-worthy role was a real withdrawal, captured on tape. If you're ready to see what an actual comeback from cocaine hell looks like, keep watching.
You know why Samuel L. Jackson screams so convincingly and so terrifyingly in every damn movie? Maybe because for decades he trained by screaming at his own demons while lying in a puddle of blackout on a kitchen floor. Our 7th hero is the man who turned motherfucker into a global brand and made billions off it. But up until he was 43, in certain New York circles, he was known for one thing only: a professional drug addict who somehow never missed a rehearsal. Hollywood loves resurrection stories, especially the ones that bring in $13 billion at the box office. But let's be real, Sam's climb to the throne started in an underworld so deep, people usually leave it feet first. It's hard to believe when you look at the current demigod, whose collection of ridiculous wigs probably costs more than the annual budget of a small country. Jackson started experimenting back in college in the late 60s, the standard starter pack: booze, weed, LSD. But once he moved to New York to conquer the stage, the stakes jumped to heroin and cocaine. The most cynical part is that Samuel genuinely believed he was a functioning addict. He bragged that he was always on time, knew his lines, hit his marks on stage, while, by his own admission, up until 1991, he had never once stepped in front of an audience sober.
Think about that level of craft, playing serious drama with a cocktail in your veins that could drop an elephant. His filthy reality finally punched through the floor in 1991, and the scene was straight out of a bleak thriller. Sam wasn't just buying drugs, he was a full-on DIY enthusiast who turned his kitchen into a freebase lab, a homemade crack setup. That's where his wife, LaTanya, and his 8-year-old daughter, Zoe, found their star unconscious, face down, surrounded by syringes, spoons, and the rest of the junky toolkit. It wasn't just an overdose, it was the total collapse of the reliable guy illusion. And his wife, apparently tired of cleaning up not only the kitchen but his reputation, gave him an ultimatum.
Either you go get help right now, or we disappear from your life for good. Jackson went to Hazelden in Minnesota, and oh, the irony. 2 weeks after he got out, Spike Lee offered him a role as a crack addict named Gator in Jungle Fever. Samuel didn't even need makeup. He was sweating, shaking, and serving real withdrawal on camera because his body was still in the middle of detox. That part became an exorcism and his ticket into the big leagues, followed by Pulp Fiction and global fame. Today, he's been clean for more than 30 years, though he admits he still has dreams where he's back in the game. Jackson managed to convert hell into paychecks and become one of the most bankable actors alive. But not everyone gets that lucky with a kitchen floor as their turning point.
And if Samuel L. Jackson could use his old needles as free props for a career launch, our next heroine had a voice blessed by heaven and the face of an angel, yet still ended up demanding journalists prove they were paying for her cocaine. We're moving on to the woman who was too rich for cheap crack, but not strong enough to climb out of a deadly bathtub. Let's see what those receipts cost the generation's biggest diva. Get your tissues ready. Actually, no. Put them away. In a world of big checks and empty syringes, tears aren't worth a damn thing. We're continuing our countdown of people who traded spotlights for that dead, cloudy stare. Next up, a woman whose notes could shatter glass and who ended up shattering herself. Whitney Houston was America's golden girl until her voice started betraying her and her face began hardening into a mask of exhausted despair. In Hollywood, there's a special kind of sport, pretending everything's fine while a star is visibly decomposing in prime time. In 2002, the world froze in front of their TVs when Whitney sat down for that now legendary interview with Diane Sawyer. It was supposed to be a moment of truth. It became a media disaster and a greatest hits album of tabloid quotes. That's when the line dropped that became the anthem of her denial.
Crack is whack. Whitney looked straight into the camera and tried to convince everyone she was too rich to smoke cheap crack, but her appearance was screaming the opposite louder than any of her biggest hits. The interview was a desperate attempt by management to scrub her image after networks had started cutting her out of Grammy and Oscar broadcasts because of erratic behavior and the simple physical fact that she couldn't reliably hit the notes anymore. But instead of redemption, viewers watched a woman who, when asked about spending millions on getting high, snapped and demanded people show her the receipts. Her addiction, well fed by a toxic marriage to Bobby Brown, turned a style icon into paparazzi prey. She was caught at airports with marijuana, found in hotels half-conscious. She was too big to quietly disappear and too broken to stay. The end, in February 2012 at the Beverly Hilton, felt like the inevitable final punctuation mark in a script of self-destruction. Whitney was found in a bathtub. Her heart, worn down by cocaine and years of heavy medication, simply gave up. The most chilling part is the timing. She died just hours before Clive Davis's party, where she was supposed to appear. Imagine the Hollywood surrealism, champagne flowing, music blasting in a ballroom downstairs, while on an upper floor, police are zipping the greatest singer of a generation into a black bag. She wasn't a victim of bad luck. She was a woman who had the entire world at her feet and flushed it down the drain with the last traces of white powder. Whitney's collapse hurt in a particular way because it was public, documented by every camera flash she learned to hate. But if Whitney was the queen of drama with a golden voice, our next hero was the king of chaos, whose arrest record could fill a mid-sized library. He didn't have time for a Diane Sawyer interview. He was too busy stealing cars while pretending to be an FBI agent. Next up, the man whose life read like one long crime blotter. Earl Simmons, better known as DMX, didn't play a gangster. He was one, and the law was more like an annoying insect than an obstacle. Other stars have periods of addiction. Earl had consistency. His criminal file kicked off in 1986 with stealing a dog out of a kennel and kept rolling all the way to his death in 2021. Over 3 decades, he got arrested about once a year, every year. That isn't a punchline, that's raw math. Driving without a license, crack possession, animal cruelty, assaulting prison guards, and even the kind of tax dodging that belongs in its own museum, $1.7 million. One episode at JFK Airport in June 2004 deserves its own Emmy in the category of dumbest crime ever committed. DMX and a partner tried to steal someone else's car by simply announcing they were FBI agents. The man had fake lights and a siren slapped onto his SUV like it was a toy cop car, then rammed the parking gate and started commanding other drivers like he owned the place. When they finally pinned him down, the car came stocked with the classics: cocaine, a weapon, and burglary tools. And you know what? By some miracle, he walked away with probation, which only fed the delusion that he was untouchable. But crack isn't the kind of partner that hands out second chances forever. His addiction was the root of every fight and every show that went up in flames. In 2010 alone, he was arrested 5 times just for violating probation because he simply couldn't stop using. Add to that 13 starving pit bulls found at his house, and you get the portrait of a man who'd completely lost contact with reality, drowning in paranoia and aggression. He was honest in his pain. His music saved millions of fans. He just couldn't save himself.
His heart finally tapped out in April 2021 after yet another overdose that triggered total organ failure. He left behind 15 children, a mountain of child support debt, and the status of a legend who never managed to step out of his own internal cage. DMX was rage and struggle in human form. But our final hero turned his worst tragedy into the greatest comedy show in history. Brace yourselves. We're moving on to the man who literally burned out on the job and made us laugh about it. On June 9, 1980, the world learned that Richard Pryor, the funniest man on the planet, had decided to turn himself into a human torch. The official story he fed the press for years was that it was an accident. A bottle of 151 proof rum supposedly exploded while he was trying to cook freebase with a butane torch. But decades later, his widow, Jennifer Lee, spilled the truth. It wasn't an accident. It was a suicide attempt in the middle of a brutal drug psychosis. Pryor drenched himself in rum, flicked a lighter, and ran outside, convinced this was a solid way to tap out. That night, he tore through the streets of Los Angeles for more than a mile before paramedics finally brought him down. Picture it, a burning superstar sprinting along the sidewalk while more than half his body turns into charred meat. In the delirium, he screamed, "God, give me one more chance." And somehow, apparently, he was heard. The most unbelievable part came 2 years later when Pryor returned to the stage and turned that inferno into the centerpiece of his legendary stand-up. He joked about the way the fire talked to him, about how cocaine had convinced him that setting himself on fire was a fantastic idea. He didn't just survive the story, he owned it, he mined it, he sold it back to the world, polished into punchlines. And the truth is, his whole life was a runway leading to that blaze. Pryor grew up in a brothel run by his grandmother. His mother was a prostitute. His father was a pimp and a boxer. With a foundation built from violence and depression, it's no shock that alcohol and drugs became his closest friends. Even in the 90s, when multiple sclerosis started turning his body into a prison, he kept drowning himself in vodka and swallowing pills by the handful, pushing himself closer to the edge. He was a genius who could turn pain into pure comedic gold. But behind the curtain, that gold smelled like smoke and hopelessness. Richard Pryor died in 2005 from cardiac arrest, leaving behind a legacy that raised an entire generation of comedians. He proved that even the ugliest personal hell can be sold to an audience, if you have the nerve to stare straight into it and tell the truth without flinching. And that's the final chord of our list. A reminder that in Hollywood, the cost of fame is rarely measured in Oscars. It's measured in burns on the soul, wounds that don't heal under the spotlight. Our trip through Hollywood's sewer canals ends here. Remember, behind every glittering headline, there's living pain, and no amount of applause can drown it out. Take care of yourselves, and don't try any of these tricks at home.